Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a lesser-known period in Jesus' life, his time in Perea towards the end of his ministry.
Yeah, Perea, it's not exactly a household name, is it?
Definitely not as familiar as, say, Galilee or Jerusalem.
Right.
So we're going to need some context here. And to make things even more interesting, our main source for this deep dive is the Urantia book. Have you ever heard of it?
I'm not surprised if you haven't. It's a bit of a mystery, really, even though some consider it to be a really significant spiritual text.
Yeah, it's not your typical historical account, is it?
Definitely not. But it offers some unique perspectives on Jesus' life and teachings.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics of the Urantia book's account of Jesus in Perea, let's set the scene geographically and culturally. What was Perea like?
Well, imagine this. It's east of the Jordan River, known for its beautiful landscapes, really stunning countryside.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was experiencing this revival of Jewish life after years under Gentile rule.
Wow, so a real melting pot of cultures and ideas.
Exactly. So you can imagine how fascinating it must have been when Jesus arrived.
Right. So what was Jesus actually doing in Perea? Was he just wandering around preaching, or was there a more organized mission happening?
Oh, no, it was definitely organized. The Urantia book tells us that he had 70 disciples, led by a man named Abner, who were going from town to town, village to village, spreading his teachings.
Oh, like a coordinated effort.
Exactly, like a well-oiled teaching machine. And meanwhile, Jesus himself was based in a town called Pella, teaching, supporting their efforts.
Yeah. Okay, so they're going out spreading the word. But what was the main message during this time in Perea? Was it any different from his earlier teachings?
That's where things get really interesting because the Urantia book points out a noticeable lack of miracle working in this period.
Really? So no more healing the sick or walking on water?
It seems not, at least not according to this text.
That's a pretty big shift. What do you make of that?
Well, it suggests that there was a real focus on the spiritual message of the gospel during this time. Almost like saying, okay, we've covered the miracles now, let's dive deep into the heart of the matter.
Interesting. So what was the spiritual message?
Right.
What was Jesus saying to the crowds in Perea?
Well, the Urantia book highlights two really powerful teachings from this time. The first is the parable of the Good Shepherd, which he actually delivers to a mixed crowd of devoted followers and skeptical Pharisees, some of whom had actually followed him from Jerusalem.
Okay, so let's unpack that parable. I mean, most people have heard it before, but I'm guessing the context here is important. What makes it so significant in this instance?
It's actually pretty radical. See, in this parable, Jesus compares himself to both the door of the sheepfold and the shepherd himself. And he contrasts true shepherds with those who exploit the flock.
Okay.
Essentially, he's claiming to be the only way to reach God.
Wow, I bet that didn't go over well with everyone, especially the Pharisees, who are all about their own interpretations of religious law.
Yeah, you can imagine the whispers. But Jesus doesn't shy away from challenging his audience. In fact, the Urantia book tells us he follows this up with another powerful teaching, a whole sermon on trust and spiritual preparedness.
Okay, give me the highlights. What did he say?
Well, he starts by warning against hypocrisy, which, let's face it, is always relevant, right?
Always.
And then he offers this beautiful reassurance of God's care. He points out that God even cares for the sparrows, even the smallest creatures.
Right.
And finally, he calls for courageous faith, even in the face of opposition.
There's that incredible image of Jesus urging his followers not to fear death, which seems like the opposite of what people expect from religious leaders, right?
Absolutely. It's incredibly powerful. Instead of promising safety and security in this life, he's urging them to focus on something far greater, something eternal.
Okay, and that actually ties in directly with his teachings on wealth and possessions, which also come up in Perea through this really fascinating encounter.
You mean the story about the young man who asks Jesus to intervene in an inheritance dispute with his brother?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes.
Seems like such an everyday problem.
It does, doesn't it? But classic Jesus, right? He uses this seemingly ordinary event to launch into this really profound teaching about wealth and possessions.
So true. So what was the message? Was it as simple as money is the root of all evil?
It's definitely more nuanced than that. It's about the danger of covetousness, placing too much importance on material wealth. He tells the story of the rich fool who hoards possessions but forgets about his own mortality.
Okay.
And ultimately, the takeaway is that spiritual treasure that lasts is far more valuable than anything we can accumulate here on Earth.
Spiritual treasure versus material wealth. It really makes you think about what we prioritize in our own lives.
Doesn't it?
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
And, speaking of priorities, the Urantia book also talks about how Jesus counsels his apostles during this time. Remember, they've left everything to follow him. So naturally, they have some concerns about their material
Oh,
needs.
I bet. That's a pretty relatable worry, isn't it? Giving up everything to pursue a spiritual path, and then it's like, wait a minute, how am I going to pay rent?
Right, exactly. It's that tension between our spiritual aspirations and our very real material needs.
So how does Jesus address that? Did he just tell them to have faith and everything would work out?
Well, it's actually more nuanced than that. It's not about neglecting your responsibilities or expecting miracles.
Okay.
He's really emphasizing the right relationship to material things, right relationship.
Right.
So like finding a balance between taking care of our needs and not getting too caught up in the pursuit of more.
Exactly. It's not that material things are inherently bad, but they shouldn't be our primary focus. It's about keeping them in perspective.
Which is where that beautiful analogy of the lilies of the field comes in.
Yes, such a powerful image. Consider the lilies how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. Yet I say to you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. It's like if God cares so beautifully for a simple wildflower, imagine how much more he cares for us.
It's both reassuring and challenging at the same time because it requires a lot of trust, right? To believe that we'll be taken care of even when we don't have all the answers.
Absolutely. And this trust wasn't just about their personal needs either. Remember, Jesus was preparing his followers for a life dedicated to spreading the gospel.
Right. And that requires immense sacrifice and unwavering faith.
It's like he's asking them to commit to a whole new way of living, where material possessions just take a backseat, and service to others is paramount.
It's a theme that echoes throughout his teachings, isn't it? True wealth isn't about what you own, but the strength of your relationships, your generosity, your connection to something greater than yourself.
And it's interesting that all of this is unfolding in Perea, this region on the cultural fringes, right? It wasn't exactly the heart of religious power or influence.
That's such an important point. It makes you wonder, does the context of these teachings delivered in this place where cultures and ideas were mixing change how we should interpret them today?
Yeah, it really does make you think. It's like these teachings coming from a place that's kind of off the beaten path have this timeless quality to them. You know what I mean? Absolutely. They transcend any particular time or place.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Jesus' time in Perea, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from this lesser-known chapter of his life?
Well, I think it really highlights the importance of the spiritual over the material. It's a call to trust in something beyond ourselves, to find true wealth in our relationships and our connection to something bigger than us.
And let's not forget that this isn't about just passively accepting things either.
Yeah.
Right? Remember how Jesus challenged his followers to be courageous,
Yeah.
to stand up for their beliefs, even when it was difficult?
Oh, absolutely. That message is as relevant today as it ever was.
Totally. And it makes you think about what it means to be a good shepherd in our own lives. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just a religious concept, is it?
No, not at all. It's about looking out for each other, showing compassion and generosity, standing up for what's right, even when it's tough.
Living a life of purpose and integrity, guided by something bigger than ourselves. And, after this deep dive, I'm really starting to see that. You don't have to be religious to find value in these teachings.
I completely agree. Stripping away the centuries of interpretation and dogma, you get down to these universal truths about trust and compassion, living a life that's aligned with our values.
That's a great point to end on. So to everyone listening, maybe these teachings from Perea will spark some reflection for you. Think about it. How do they resonate with your own life? What does it mean to prioritize your own spiritual well-being, to cultivate trust, to be a good shepherd in your own way?
Those are really good questions to ponder.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Jesus' time in Perea. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming.